Hello, all you Bible junkies out there. Welcome back to studying the book of Revelation and God's plan to the end. Today, we are finally launching into the final 7-year period, which God has given us a glimpse of through Scripture of some of the events that may play out as we prepare for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we are going to be looking here today at Revelation chapter 6, the first opening verses, where the first seal judgments are broken by Jesus Christ himself, unleashing the beginning last judgment plagues upon the earth. We'll look at the rise of the Antichrist, capital A, Antichrist, the big shot for Satan's army there. And also we're going to be looking at the rise of the false prophet and as they play out through this story. So, if you've got your Bibles, go ahead, get ready to open up to chapter 6 as we begin looking at the scroll judgments. At this point in the story, we are now at that start of what we call the tribulation period. This is a time period of 7 years. The story of Revelation is traditionally broken into 2 3.5 year periods. The first is referred to as the tribulation, 3.5 years, and then we like to call the second half, the second 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation period. This is where God's most awful and severe judgments are brought upon the earth. These numbers are symbolic. They help us understand some of the events that take place in this final 7-year period. We find these number periods in reference in Revelation chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, chapter 12, verse 6, and in chapter 13, verse 5. The first period also is identified as 1,260 days, or 42 months, or 3.5 years. So depending on your translation of the Bible, you may run into all of those numbers, but they all refer to the first half of the tribulation period. These opening years mark the start of the rule of the Antichrist, Satan's champion, the beginning of the oppression of the saints. Now, when the book of Revelation speaks of the saints, it primarily is talking about Israel during this time period. So, oppression of Jews. We also can include within the category of the saints those who are not Jewish but were left behind during the rapture, and they give their lives to Jesus Christ during this period. So they are newly converted Christians during this period. So we've got oppression of Jews, and we've got the oppression of a newly formed church. We have then the witness of God's champions. We'll get into that a little bit later. God will choose 2 champions to continue to advance the gospel message of Jesus Christ. During these opening years, we may also encounter Israel's flight into the wilderness. We get that reference in chapter 12. We skipped over those verses to return to them when we get to that point where the Jewish population in Jerusalem will flee to the wilderness because of the oppression that the Antichrist will bring upon them. And of course, we have the start of God's judgments during these opening years. This first round, the first 3.5 year period, connects with Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. So look that one up. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And that's where we get primarily the biblical Old Testament reference to this first 3.5 years. The second 3.5 years, which we call the Great Tribulation, is, as I mentioned, as a reference to the increasing disastrous judgments of God. This period connects with Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. So again, look that one up. Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. During this last 3.5 year period, the two champions of God will be killed. The Antichrist will suppress temple worship. The protection of God's remnant on the earth will be supernaturally sustained. You'll see the merging of the Antichrist and Satan. They will become one person there. We have the worst of God's judgments, and of course then we conclude with the second coming of Jesus Christ, the final battle of Armageddon and the great white throne judgment there. It's important to note that there are other numerical references to the end times. Daniel uses a lot of numbers. He uses phrases like time, time and a half time to refer to God's plan to the end. John, in recording his revelation from Jesus, does not use all of Daniel's symbolic numbers. He primarily holds to these 2 3.5 year periods. So if you take those two references from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and you add to it the numbers of Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, you get your 7-year period of tribulation. During this time, there is a massive war, a supernatural war going on for humanity. You have God fighting to try and redeem any last remnant of believers in Jesus Christ. And you have Satan trying to basically rise above his own status and become Jesus Christ to many people, deceiving them to follow him instead of the true Lord of heaven and earth. So you have God on one side, you have Satan on the other side, and they are battling it out for the fate of humankind. Each side, good and evil, God and Satan, are going to choose champions. Champions that will then represent them on earth. For Satan, that champion is what we call the Antichrist. The one who tries to take the place of Jesus Christ in people's lives. So we start looking at Revelation chapter 6. And we read with verse 1. Then John, remember John is in heaven at this moment. He's been transported up. He saw the throne of God in chapter 4. And in chapter 5, he saw the Lamb who was slain and worthy to take the scroll, receive these opening 7 judgments, each represented by a seal on this scroll from the throne of God. So now we read, then John saw the Lamb who was slaughtered and yet is alive forevermore. Christ Jesus himself hold forth the scroll, which he had taken from the right hand of his Father, the one who is seated upon the great white throne. And he opened the first of the 7 seals. John then heard one of the 4 fiery cherubim call out as with a voice like thunder, "Come forward and record now what you see." What happens now with the cracking of the first seal is the rise of the Antichrist. John, later on, at the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, returns to this moment, and he gives us a much more in-depth description of the rise of the Antichrist. So we're going to pause chapter 6 at the moment, after reading only 1 verse, and we're going to jump over to chapter 12, verse 18. So take a moment, flip through your pages, get with me, Revelation chapter 12, verse 18. We're going to read into chapter 13, verse 2. John looked, and to his surprise he beheld once again the great red fiery dragon. Now remember, this is the same character. This is Satan, the wily serpent, who tried to devour Jesus Christ at his birth in chapter 12, who then, when Jesus was resurrected and ascended back into heaven, followed Jesus and made war with God's angels. Michael then defeated Satan, and he kicked, by God's authority, this great red dragon out of heaven. He falls back upon the earth, and now he's stewing around. He is just really, really, really vexed in his spirit. So now John sees once again the great red fiery dragon, who is the devil, Satan, standing upon the sand of a seashore. And as he watched, a terrible beast, who is the Antichrist, rose out of the chaos of the waters, having 10 horns and 7 heads, which resembled those of the dragon itself. So the Antichrist rises out of chaos. And that's an important part to note. We'll hopefully get back to that if I remember to. So he rises out of international chaos. That's where we get the reference to the sea here. The sea was a symbol for chaos. And the Antichrist has the same characteristics, the same qualities as his master, Satan. So they look alike in the story. And its 10 horns, or on its 10 horns were 10 golden crowns, while on its 7 heads were written all kinds of blasphemous names. So this is no friend to God. John, in recording what he saw, described the form of the Antichrist as a leopard, with its feet like a bear's and its mouth like a lion's. The dragon then extended his power, his throne, and his great authority over the people of the earth to this terrible beast. And so Satan has elected his champion. He's chosen his champion. And he bestows upon his champion his own power and authority to rule. Jumping back now to chapter 6, so take a moment, flip back now to chapter 6. We're going to continue with verse 2. And while John looked, okay, verse 1, Jesus breaks open the first seal. Verse 2, while John looked on, behold, a white horse suddenly appeared. The terrible beast, who is the Antichrist, mounted the white horse while holding a bow. And a crown was given to him. And he rode out as a subjugator, a conqueror, over the people of the earth. And he conquered the whole world. All right, so let's take a moment and let's unpack this rise of the Antichrist here at the opening of this 7-year period. So we are told that Jesus, in chapter 6, he receives the scroll, or in chapter 5, he receives the scroll. In chapter 6, he opens the first seal. The first seal, actually I should say the first 4 seals represent 4 horsemen. This is where we get the reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Each horseman is a symbolic representation of what is going on at this particular point in this final 7-year period of Revelation. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse can also be found in Zechariah, from the Old Testament, Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. There we get another reference to 4 colored horses here. Well, this first one is a white horse. What does white represent? Well, white often is a symbolic color for peace and for victory. So what's going on here? Well, when we connect this with the idea of the Antichrist rising out of a chaotic sea, we get the idea that the world is in turmoil. This would make absolute sense if the rapture has just taken place. Because as we described last time in looking at the rapture, following Christ removing his true Christians up into the air with him, there would be tremendous worldwide destruction and death as airplanes would fall to the ground, cars would crash, ships would run into things. You'd have massive problems with electricity and utilities, and the whole world just in shock and mourning. So with this, regardless of what's going on, there's chaos in the world. Great chaos. And we're talking more chaos than what already is happening. So during this time, one particular figure will rise from this chaos, and he will bring peace to the world. he will begin to unite the world under his own victorious rule. So the white horse appears, and he's carrying with him, the rider, the Antichrist, is carrying with him a bow. The bow is an imitation of God himself. God is often referred to in the Old Testament as riding on a victorious horse or a victorious chariot carrying a bow. You can see references to that in Psalm chapter 45, verses 4 and 5. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 8 through 9. So the Antichrist appears, and he appears as establishing worldwide peace as not only a man of God, but as basically God himself. He has God-like qualities that draw people to him. He's wearing a crown. Now, this is not the diadem crown that Satan wears. No, this is the crown of wreaths, the victory crown, which is a sign of his success and his authority. Now, here's a good question. Here's something for you to think about here tonight. Who actually gives the Antichrist his crown and authority? At first glance, it seems to be it's Satan. I mean, John records, and Satan extended his power, his throne, and his great authority to the Antichrist over the people, so that the Antichrist can rule. But who's really in control of Satan? Well, it's God. So, does God give the Antichrist his authority and his success? Or is it the world? Do the people of the world authorize the Antichrist to have power and to rule? Are they so desperate for a man of peace that they will allow this one ruler to have godlike authority? Food for thought. All right, and we're told that the rider goes forth to conquer the world. So a white horse, a rider coming out of chaos to bring peace, carries a bow representing the qualities of God, and he goes forth to conquer the world. We read about this same event in Daniel chapter 9. In verse 27, we're told about the Antichrist, even in the Old Testament, riding to establish peace. What's going on here? Well, the Antichrist is trying to imitate the sovereign reign of Jesus Christ. The Antichrist is promising peace to all who will unite under his own authority. The Antichrist, we are told, has, hold on, let me look it up here. He has 10 horns. These 10 horns represent his ability to redefine the borders of the entire world. He will change the way we look at the world to represent 10 countries, 10 kingdoms. Those are a representation of his 10 horns that he has. So he will change the geographic portrayal of the world to now only represent 10 areas of land. Jumping back to Revelation chapter 13 and verses 1 and 2, we can compare this Antichrist with also Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 through 7 here. We mentioned that, you know, this first beast that rises out of the sea, the Antichrist, looks like the dragon. If you compare Revelation chapter 13, he's actually a combination of the 4 beasts that we find in Daniel chapter 7. We're told he has 7 heads. The 7 heads, once again, is a symbolic reference to complete authority. His ability to have absolute sway and influence over the people of the world. I tell you, this guy is so charismatic. He will have such a almost a supernatural magnetism about him that the remaining people of the world will be just caught in total wonder and deep awe and respect for this man or woman. Anyways, so the Antichrist has 7 heads. He's got absolute rule over the people. During this opening time period where the first seal is broken, the Antichrist will take an unsettled state of affairs. He'll take worldwide political turmoil and he will turn it into peace. Peace. That may seem a little strange. The very first judgment of God, the first of 21 in this time period, is a judgment of peace. But here's the catch. It's a deceptive peace. It's the peace before the storm. We're told that the Antichrist has blasphemous names written all over him. These are his claims to being God, right? He's carrying that bow. He's taking God's authority. And now he's taking God's name and applying it, all of that to himself. He has the body of a leopard. Ancient folk thought that leopards were bloodthirsty and cruel. So this person, he's a figurehead of peace to begin with, but in reality, he's a tyrant. He's a figure of power. He has the feet of a bear. Bear represents strength. And he has the mouth of a lion. So he imposes fear. That's pretty much how the Antichrist rules. He rules from a standpoint of fear. His subjects, the rest of the people of the world, they fear him. They're in awe and wonder at his great abilities and his magnetic characteristics. But when he shows his true colors, it will be out of fear that they subject to him. The Bible talks about many antichrists that have, continue, and will go out into the world. The word antichrist in the Greek language simply means anyone or anything that takes the place of Jesus Christ in your life. Your spouse could be an antichrist if you love your spouse more than Jesus Christ. Your kids can be antichrists if they have first priority instead of Jesus in your life. Your work can be antichrist. Money can be an antichrist. Sex can be an Antichrist. Anything that takes the place of Jesus in your life is an Antichrist. But there is one Antichrist who will be far, far worse than any before. This is what I like to call the capital A Antichrist. This is the end-time Antichrist that I've been talking about here. So the Antichrist comes, the Antichrist starts to rule. What does the Antichrist then do? Well, now let's jump back to Revelation chapter 13. So go from chapter 6, flip your pages back to chapter 13. Now we're going to look at verses 11 and the start of verse 12. One of the first things that the Antichrist will do, other than redefining the geographic borders of the world into 10 kingdoms, then we read this. Then John saw a second beast, a false prophet, rise out of the earth. Now notice, the first one, the Antichrist, rises out of the sea, out of a time of chaos and turmoil. Earth is symbolic of stability. So now the world has become stable under his rule. Now he raises up a false prophet. And the false prophet had 2 horns like a lamb, but it also spoke like the great red dragon. This second beast exercised all the authority of the first terrible beast on his behalf. And as the Antichrist subjected the whole earth, the second beast forced the inhabitants of the earth to worship the first terrible beast in all of his power and might. So now we get the rise of what we call the false prophet, or Satan's second champion. He is the Antichrist's right-hand man, his go-to guy. This one comes up out of the earth. He has 2 horns. He speaks with the voice of the Antichrist, the voice of Satan. The 2 horns represent possibly a dual role that this figurehead will play. One is a political role, and the other is a religious role. So he is both a politician and a priest. Because notice, what does he do? He forces the inhabitants of the world to begin to worship. What do they worship? They don't worship God. They worship the Antichrist, their one world ruler. So the idea here, essentially, some of the things that we can look to give us an idea, what's happening, is worldwide chaos, worldwide suffering. Out of this comes a political figure who brings peace, who has godlike qualities, who conquers the world. So basically, the world rulers, world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, they give their governmental authority to this one ruler. This one ruler then redefines the entire globe into 10 kingdoms. This one ruler then chooses a false prophet to be both a politician, to be in charge of the 10 kingdoms, and also as priest, to create what you might call a one world religion. That religion is the worship of the Antichrist. So imagine, it's not just newly converted Christians who are going to have trouble with this. It's not just the Jews who are going to have trouble with this. It's anyone who is devoted to their religious beliefs. Muslims, Buddhists, you name it. Now they have to worship the Antichrist in order to survive. And if they don't, there's going to be severe penalties that can even lead to death imposed upon the population of the world. We're going to look into that a little bit later on. All right, so that's the start of the 7-year period. It starts with the rise of the Antichrist, which is the breaking of the first seal, the authority given to the Antichrist to rule and conquer the world, the rise of Satan's second champion, the false prophet, who speaks on behalf of the Antichrist, who speaks on behalf of Satan himself here. All of these are trying to imitate and displace God and Jesus Christ in the life of people. Now, as I mentioned, both sides, God and Satan, good and evil, choose their champions. So next time, we're going to start examining God's side, God's two champions, whom he will send to be a thorn in the Antichrist side. Join us next time as we continue our study of Revelation Revisited.